Japan offers so much. You know, it's not a simple society.
Right. And
And
sure is
so
not.
every time I come back, it's, I get stimulated. And I feel every time I come back, I feel I really know nothing about Japan.
Takie Sugiyama Lebra was born and raised in Japan, but for many years has been a professor of anthropology at the University of Hawaii. Dr. Lebra has written many books and articles about the lives of Japanese women and about Japanese human relations. Her most recent book, Above the Clouds, is a study of Japan's modern aristocracy. Today, Dr. Lebra is the guest of David W. Plath, professor of anthropology and Asian studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
You know, Takie, for years I've thought of you as having that quiet confidence that I think of as belonging to an aristocrat. So, are you studying your own people? Are you an aristocrat?
Okay, my answer is yes and no. No, because I have nothing to do with aristocracy in blood. In fact, I'm from a peasant class. Probably that's why I got interested in the subject. But as I got involved with this research deeply, I found myself in them. In other words, the initial interest was that to find out what's the difference in terms of class between the upper class and lower class and so on. And there is difference, that's what I found, but at the same time, you find something in common, which is shared by all classes. And in that sense, yes, I found myself.
How did they react to you coming in to talk to them, to interview them?
Well,
you
that's,
interviewed
yes.
dozens, maybe even hundreds of people.
Yes, more than
and
100 I
Great
did.
variety, I'm
Yeah.
sure, from person to
Right,
person. But
right. The first, some rejected me totally from the very beginning because they thought I was a journalist. And they were just fed up of the scandalization by the media. And so in that case, I had to explain, of course, who I was. And being a professor was quite convincing to them and that of my scholarly interest. And also, as an anthropologist, I thought this is a good experience for me. They were a kind of outsider to me. See, for the first time, I was doing on outsiders, as all anthropologists do. And I was an outsider in two senses. One is in terms of status. I'm a status outsider. And also being a marginal foreigner, and so these actually helped me a lot in getting their cooperations. And I'm sure they thought I'm safe as an outsider. If you are insider, the network is so thick that they would be very, very cautious. See? And also I will be away anyway sometime from Japan.
probably a lot of Americans would be very surprised to even hear about an aristocracy in Japan. But yet there was this aristocracy. And I think most Americans, and as I would have initially, had this image, well, somehow there was this great Oriental kingdom in the past, and everything was complicated, and now it's a democratic society. And how did we get from that first image to today's image?
Of course, there was a radical change after the war, and nobody wanted to talk about them, and they themselves kind of shut up. And it would have been impossible to study them because of the inhibition, and they felt guilty about the whole thing, and so they would rather have it, quiet. And when I started to do research on this, they began to open up. The time passed, long enough, and so they kind of wanted to talk about themselves because children are not interested, and that they wanted to leave some, legacy to posterity. And so I kind of hit the right time. And also, even though it was totally abolished legally, still there are things which are surviving in terms of sustaining this system, such as emperor system on the one hand, and ancestor cult on the other. And still the ancestors are very important for Japanese, because the Japanese don't have the Judeo-Christian type of God, and the ancestor is a real spiritual sustenance for them. And when they trace their ancestors, they tend to go up, and eventually will reach some big figure. Maybe starting from the village headman, and maybe samurai, karo, daimyo, or court noble, the kuge, and royal prince, emperor, or god in the Kojiki. See, and so I think that kind of orientation is still obtains very strongly among Japanese. And so this makes, therefore, the study of abolished aristocracy still contemporarily relevant. And this is through observations of rituals and kind of festivals, you see, and where the old aristocrats, whether it is kuge or daimyo descendants, play a very prominent role, such as in daimyo parade and ancestral, the memorial services, of course. And when there is the memorial service of the daimyo, first generation daimyo of a house, is held. Just all vassals, the so-called vassals, come from all over the country, and it becomes a huge group. And for them, the existence of the descendant of a daimyo is very important for their own identities. So they are the ones who keep track on, memorial services and let the daimyo know.
Well, the aristocracy, the kazoku, that's part of Japan that most people like me will never even see or have any experience of. What's it feel like to be an aristocrat?
To be an aristocrat. Well, that was my feeling. I mean, I would find something very different from us. But in fact, the non-aristocratic classes have a lot to do with them in terms of the sustaining the aristocratic status. In fact, many aristocrats say that, well, among ourselves, we are very free. We can say anything we want. We can behave very, very naturally, freely, without much etiquette and so on. But once somebody else comes in as a part of audience, then we are very, very aware. We become very nervous about their presence, and we try to behave in conformity to their expectations. So what I found most characteristic of this class was the presence, just the omnipresence of servants, of all ranks. The servants themselves are all hierarchically organized, and everything is done through servants. And other kinds of direct contacts, therefore, within the family are quite constrained, even between parent and children, even mother and child, and which was a real revelation to me, because I was convinced that in Japan, mother-child relationship is very tight, And motherhood is something very, very sacred, and so on and so forth. And here I find a quite different image of the mother-child relationship or motherhood as such. For me, the Japanese womanhood kind of boils down or is sublimated to motherhood. That was my impression, and I still do believe that. And yet, from this study, it's a very class-bound. That image is class-bound, and so it's not necessarily shared by this class. In addition, children were trained by maid servants to be real aristocrats, and it wasn't a mother, it wasn't really a father who trained to be like them, but rather the servants.
Well, that's one of the wonderful paradoxes that you
Yes.
bring out in the book. That here are servants training people to perform kinds of behavior, use kinds of language that the servants themselves are not going to be doing.
That's right.
Real drama coaches in a very important sense. Part of the picture I get from your book is a sort of Japanese version of upstairs, downstairs.
Yes.
And it seems to me there are many similarities. In fact, I've even thought maybe somebody should take the book and do a television drama, Japanese, except that it wouldn't be upstairs, downstairs. It would be what? Inside, outside?
Inside, yes. That's a very, very important point, Dave. It's not just up above and below, but also, of course, front and rear. In the front where for example, the guest rooms are very nicely built. Guest rooms are in front, and the back side is a kitchen and maid's rooms and so on and so forth. And these are very, very universal, I think, this up, down, front, and rear. But in addition, in the Japanese aristocracy or royalty also, you have another dimension, which is interior versus exterior. And interior is where the okami, the master family resides, and exterior is where the managers, the servants, so-called male servants, do businesses for the house. And so there is a kind of correlation between the above and front and interior. And this creates a lot of conflict because you are front person and at the same time internal person. See, so it's just like, you can look at the emperor in that light also. He is inside, within the innermost area of the palace, but at the same time the uppermost and also frontmost. And how can you do all these things? And I think that's where the Japanese concept of authority, hierarchy, and the power reside.
Now, in terms of this relationship between servants at their various levels and the aristocracy, one of the pictures that I get from upstairs, downstairs is that when the people upstairs are failing to perform their roles properly, it's the servants who bring them in line, that the servants are as much invested in good performance by people upstairs as they are in their own performance.
They are very, very frank about this. When my informants explain why this house has been successful or has failed since Meiji Restoration or after the war, is just utterly due to the servants' wisdom or loyalty.
What about the present-day economic position of the ex-aristocrats? Are most of them wealthy?
Well, many are doing very well, more than, of course, average Japanese.
This is inherited land,
either
money.
through the good management of whatever was left.
Thanks to the servants.
Thanks to the servant, or intermarrying. And that's very, very common, just marrying into bourgeois, very rich individual families. But some are very, really impoverished. Quite, just, one, I would say about one room apartment,
Really?
where everything is there, kitchen and everything, just fantastically. Not much.
No servants?
Poor, no servant. Servants are very, very few, and only a few houses have servants. But that makes a lot of difference. Even if you have only one servant, the whole lifestyle is different from those who don't have any. You see, first of all, when you visit the house, you are received by a servant first. And, he brings or she brings the tea and so on and so forth.
Right.
So, so one servant's presence makes a lot of difference. And
What sorts of things do you think they were afraid you might reveal? I'm not asking you to reveal them, but what sorts of things were they afraid would make them look bad or whatever?
Well, one thing is the marriage, particularly the polygynous. I shouldn't use the word polygynous, but when a man had more than one woman, particularly concubines, and that was a very touchy subject. But that's what I wanted to know most. And so I didn't get the very frank information on this from those who are directly involved. But I did get information on this from grandchildren. So grandchildren told me about their grandmothers who were concubines. Yeah. And they were also servants. See, servant concubines.
Right.
And so they tell me how they called their blood grandmothers by first name without son, yobiste, like a servant. And while they had other grandmother who was a legal cultural mother. So my differentiation is natural mother versus cultural mother, and that was quite interesting. And that's what I'm going to do next.
Going to do next what? Become a concubine? Or?
Becoming, well, nobody wants me as a concubine. But I do want to study male-female relationship, particularly this concubinal setup.
Children or grandchildren of concubines, how does that, is it a stigma, first of all, and if so, how does it affect their chances then for marriage?
Yeah, well, I think here you have to think about historical change. Before the Meiji Restoration, before the new law, the modern new law, evidently they say there was no difference. So the children were treated equally. The mothers were not necessarily equally treated, particularly in the daimyo families or shogun families. There was clear difference between the legal seisai and sokushitsu, the concubine, in terms of status. Seisai should come from the one of these top 5 families, gosekke, or royal princesses. And so that was seisai, and some say it's okazari. They're really decorative.
Just decorative.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the real thing was going on with other women. So there's a quite clear distinction there. See. The children, as far as children, there was more equality. See. And after Meiji, there was a kind of a clear notion of illegitimacy established and so on. And yet, the emperor had no sons by his legal wife, the empress. So the emperor was the exception. It's the emperor's. So Emperor Meiji's children were all by concubines, and they were treated like real legal children. You see, there was no discrimination, nobody to discriminate against. You see.
Yeah, one thing that people often ask me and that I can't answer, and I'd be interested in your answer to it, how does this kind of concubines, keeping of mistresses and whatnot, differ among the aristocracy from what went on in the rest of society? Now, poor men presumably couldn't afford mistresses, but were their values any different? Was it just a matter of money, money and status, that poor families couldn't do this?
Well, okay. I think in the case of aristocracy, there was legitimation in terms of succession. That is, this is a hereditary class, and therefore there has to be an heir, male heir, and that was the biggest rationale for having concubines. And so until somebody bears a son, the man, the master, can keep having one more women, and so that is a very important one. Whereas in the other classes, there is no clear justification in that along that line.
This is fascinating. Are you saying that the aristocracy did not practice adoption then of male heirs?
That's not true at all. I mean, they did.
They did.
So they did, and
but also concubinage.
Yes, both. Yes, and in fact, I think the aristocrats practiced adoption even more than other classes. Again, with the same rationale, their year is more important than in any other classes. You see, and so just a fantastic frequency of adoption. And but if you look at it closely, they do adopt from close kin. So there is so some claim that it's just throughout it's one bloodline, they say. You see, and there is some reason for that. You see, it's a blood relationship. It's still important. Whereas in other classes, maybe there's more freedom in adopting others, totally unrelated.
Present law doesn't recognize secondary wives at all, as I understand it, does it?
Not as a secondary wife. It's somebody separate. I mean, a woman who can have a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she may have a child, but the child belongs to the mother.
Yeah. Not to the family.
Yeah. But unless there is some a legal arrangement which requires the legal mother, legal wife's approval, of course.
We've talked mostly about the women. What about the aristocrat men? Where do they fit into all this? Except as spoiled boys spoiled by servants.
Well,
I'm joking.
You think so, but and I thought so too. But that's not necessarily true, and they have their image, a similar image of themselves. You see, that
the men
being spoiled,
the men
and women both. You see, by servants and so on, and so therefore, some families try to kind of prevent that by systematically training their children, particularly sons, in a very tough way, much more than ordinary people. For example, the separating sons from the family as little boys, for example, separating from their particularly female servants when you reach a certain age, particularly 7, in Confucian way.
7, sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Some family, particularly big daimyo families, did kind of oust their sons to a kind of juku or family school.
And wasn't this psychologically devastating?
Yeah,
Any sense
I think the more informants, who fit in this category, tend to say that it was awful. I mean, I don't know any warm feelings about my parents. And I really feel that was a terrible thing to do.
What do you think will be the reaction of the people themselves when they read your book?
Not all people will be pleased. Yeah, I'm sure. See, I can't write a book which would please everybody.
Well, no,
anyway,
no.
I mean every informant. You see. So, and yet I tried not to hurt them either. So it's all anonymous, which is very, very difficult to do, to make it anonymous, because these are kind of conspicuous people.
Yes, whose
You
names
see,
are in the papers sometimes.
I can't say
and who will be easy to
Shogunal,
recognize.
Shogunal in house. I can't say that. You see, one of the contributions I possibly made was to correct stereotypes. For one thing, I wouldn't say all stereotypes are wrong, but many are wrong. So that may be one thing. And I think many are sophisticated enough to see the value of such things, you see. And probably many would appreciate objective description of them.
Is it the kind of field work you'd like to do again?
Well, it was fun. It was really the greatest fun I have ever had in my research. And always I was obsessed. All these 10 years, I was preoccupied with it. And I thought, well, until I finish this, I can't die peacefully. Now I can die.
Take your time. In doing all of this, did you ever get back home in the evening and say, gee, I wish I'd been born an aristocrat?
Never. Never. I didn't think, in fact, the opposite was true. Every time I did an interview, I thought, oh, I'm so glad I wasn't.
You didn't want to have to go through all that tough training.
Not tough training and constraint. You see, as a status holder, you see, everybody's watching you, and you are always kind of performing in front of the public, and no real privacy. And even in the private sphere, your servants are watching you, see. And I thought, God, I'm so lucky.
Well, I'm lucky that you've been able to come and talk some more with me.
Oh.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm very honored.